Well, hello. If someone's in the chat, if you just let me know if you can hear me, I hope you can. But it's okay if not. I can actually just listen back. I think I'll just do that real quick. Should have had this set up earlier. Oh my gosh, look at this. What did they call that when your wires get all twisted around? What's that called? Well, whatever it is. I got it on my headphones. That's okay. I worked it out. Okay. Well, went and posted everywhere so people knew that I'm doing this. I think... Let me get this thing turned on. Oh my gosh. Well, hey, okay. We got to get right to it. Look, first of all, look at this outstanding... Look at this outstanding backdrop we have tonight. Really top shelf. Google did not disappoint. Okay, really top shelf backdrop. So I listened back to the recording last week, the Wizard of Oz recording. And by the way, that went splendidly well. We'll talk about that in just a second. And golly me, is there a lot of noise. Right now I've got the fan running. It's a little bit warmer today. Not too bad, but a little bit warmer. And if I get hot, and I'm in a closed room, I could open that door, but I really don't want to. It's messy out there in the basement. And so right now I actually have fewer lights on this time than I did. It's just the one light here above me, which is it's got a little warmth to it, not too bad. But I took my computer over to my friend Brent's house, and he was really generous in letting me use his air compressor to blow out my computer, and I can already tell it made a difference. Thank you, Brent. And I also blew out the dust from my old PS4, which I think we're going to put upstairs. So I'm very grateful, Brent, for you letting me do that, man. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So a couple housekeeping items. I'm aware of that. When I listened back to Wizard of Oz, I thought, oh my gosh, what is this? It just sounded awful. And I don't know what to do about that. I have some ideas. I know it was the computer too. It wasn't the fan, it was the computer. I found what they call a pass-through. You've probably seen them. It looks like a light socket, but they're a bunch of like fuzzy bristles, and you can pass the cords through it. And so what I might do is I might get that and install it here in this wall. This is just drywall here. It's stone on the other two sides. Drywall behind me too. And then I'll put the computer out there in the basement and then just run the cords through, and that should cut down on the noise significantly. If I knew I had more of a dedicated space, I would definitely put up carpet on the walls, go get some clearance rugs from IKEA and all that, but that's just not feasible right now. So anyway, know that I'm aware of that. I can hear it too. If we do make recordings of any of this, it will not come out in the recordings because we're able to do noise reduction in Audacity and all of that. So just be aware that I am aware of those things. Okay, well, let's get started. Tonight, we have this quote here, I should say over here, from our friend George MacDonald, Scottish author, minister, Christian. And look at this great quote. Even if wholly fictitious, a good story is always true. What a great saying. And so we're going to enjoy him this evening in 3 installments. First, we'll have... did I actually bring the books over? Here we go. We'll have Little Daylight, which there are some pictures I'll show you as we go along. Little Daylight. And then we'll switch over. That's from The Wise Woman and Other Stories, although it was published in a different anthology. And then we'll switch over to the book The Golden Key and Other Stories. I think I got these books back when I was in college, maybe. And we'll switch over here. Oh, no, it's in the back of this one. And we'll read a rather short little thing called The Castle, a Parable. And then we'll go to Golden Key and Other Stories for the history of Photogen and Nectaris. So there you go. That's what we'll do tonight, and that will be our stream. So let's get started. I'm already a little groggy. I would have had a cup of coffee, but I don't want to drink a cup of coffee right before I read because it'll kind of shock my voice, my throat a little bit. So I'll just keep drinking water and hope for the best. Oh, and I'm still learning. I heard how loud the the water sounds were when I drink. I'll try to keep it really quiet, but I heard myself I heard the water in my mouth, and I was like, "Oh, that's not pleasant." So I'm still learning. This is the second live stream I've done along those lines, and so just be patient with me. We'll get it locked in. Every time improvements. Like this time, did you see the starting soon? Is that fun? That's an old picture. That was me in college. Okay, here we go. Oh, of course, my gosh. Audacity. Let me run that real quick. Once again, while I'm doing this, just so you know, that I will not be reading the chat while I read. I have Audacity up in front of me to watch the waveform as it records. And so if you would like me to read anything or read your comments, or if you make a donation to my Extra Life campaign, I will see it. Check 1, 2. Check. Test 1. Check 1. Test. Okay. If you make a donation to my Extra Life campaign, which I thank you for, please know that I will read tomorrow. I'll read them when I take chapter breaks. Photogen and Nectaris has a bunch of little things in it, so just be understanding of that. I'll read it occasionally. So here we go. I hope that you're all snuggled in. Maybe you're... Let's see, it's 8 o'clock here, 9 o'clock on the East Coast. Maybe you're just putting the kids to bed, and you've got me on the Kindle. You're laying with them there in bed, trying to get them to calm down, relax. Maybe you went to a birthday party today like we did. Wonderful. Happy birthday, Audrey. And the kids are excited and full of sugar from donuts or cake or whatever. Or maybe you had... Maybe you had a really hard day today. Maybe you're one of the many people in the mighty Pacific Northwest who are afflicted by these wildfires. Maybe your husband or wife or child or parent is on the fire line tonight. I don't know where you are in your life or in your heart or in your mind tonight. Wherever you are, we've somehow found each other, haven't we? With our friend George MacDonald, who has 3 stories to share with us. Here we go. Little Daylight by George MacDonald. Read by Eric Thompson. Little Daylight was originally reprinted from Works of Fancy and Imagination, published in 1871. Little Daylight is in the public domain. No house of any pretension to be called a palace is in the least worthy of the name, except it has a wood near it, very near it, and the nearer, the better. Not all round it, I don't mean that, for a palace ought to be open to the sun and wind, and stand high and brave, with weathercocks glittering and flags flying. But on one side of every palace there must be a wood. And there was a very grand wood indeed, beside the palace of the king who was going to be Daylight's father. Such a grand wood that nobody yet had ever gotten to the other end of it. Near the house it was kept very trim and nice, and it was free of brushwood for a long way in. But by degrees it got wild, and it grew wilder and wilder and wilder, until some said wild beasts at last did what they liked in it. The king and his courtiers often hunted, however, and this kept the wild beasts far away from the palace. One glorious summer morning, when the wind and sun were out together, when the vanes were flashing and the flags frolicking against the blue sky, Little Daylight made her appearance from somewhere, nobody could tell where, a beautiful baby with such bright eyes that she might have come from the sun, only by and by she showed such lively ways that she might equally well have come out of the wind. There was great jubilation in the palace, for this was the first baby the queen had had, and there is as much happiness over a new baby in a palace as in a cottage. But there is one disadvantage of living near a wood. You do not know quite who your neighbors may be. Everybody knew there were in it several fairies living within a few miles of the palace, who always had had something to do with each new baby that came, for fairies live so much longer than we that they can have business with a good many generations of human mortals. The curious houses they lived in were well known also. One a hollow oak, another a birch tree, though nobody could ever find how that fairy made a house of it, another a hut of growing trees, intertwined and patched up with turf and moss. But there was another fairy who had lately come to the place, and nobody even knew she was a fairy except the other fairies. A wicked old thing she was, always concealing her power, and being as disagreeable as she could in order to tempt people to give her offense, that she might have the pleasure of taking vengeance upon them. The people about thought she was a witch, and those who knew her by sight were careful to avoid offending her. She lived in a mud house in a swampy part of the forest. In all history, we find that fairies give their remarkable gifts to prince or princess, or any child of sufficient importance in their eyes, always at the christening. Now this we can understand because it is an ancient tradition among human beings as well, and it is not hard to explain why wicked fairies should choose the same time to do unkind things. But it is difficult to understand how they should be able to do them, for you would fancy all wicked creatures would be powerless on such an occasion. But I never knew of any interference on the part of a wicked fairy that did not turn out a good thing in the end. What a good thing, for instance, it was that one princess should sleep for 100 years. Was she not saved from all the plague of young men who were not worthy of her? And did she not come awake exactly at the right moment when the right prince kissed her? For my part, I cannot help wishing a good many girls would sleep till just the same fate overtook them. It would be happier for them and more agreeable to their friends. Of course, all the known fairies were invited to the christening, but the king and queen never thought of inviting an old witch. For the power of the fairies they have by nature, whereas a witch gets her power by wickedness. The other fairies, however, knowing the danger thus run, provided as well as they could against accidents from her quarter, but they could neither render her powerless, nor could they arrange their gifts in reference to hers beforehand, for they could not tell what those might be. Of course, the old hag was there without being asked. Not to be asked was just what she wanted, that she might have a sort of reason for doing what she wished to do. For somehow even the wickedest of creatures likes a pretext for doing the wrong thing. 5 fairies had one after the other given the child such gifts. Such. We'll try that again. 5 fairies had one after. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. 5 fairies had one after the other given the child such gifts as each counted best, and the 5th had just stepped back to her place in the surrounding splendor of ladies and gentlemen when, mumbling a laugh between her toothless gums, the wicked fairy hobbled out into the middle of the circle, and at the moment the lady of the head... and at the moment... I have to use a little guide here. Let's try that. I'm going to take that sentence again. I'm going to go with 5 fairies again. 5 fairies had one after the other given the child such gifts as each counted best, and the 5th had just stepped back to her place in the surrounding splendor of ladies and gentlemen when, mumbling a laugh between her toothless gums, the wicked fairy hobbled out into the middle of the circle, and at the moment when the archbishop was handing the baby to the lady at the head of the nursery department of state affairs, addressed him thus, giving a bite or two to every word before she could part with it. "Please, your grace, I'm very deaf. Would your grace remind repeating the princess's name?" "With pleasure, my good woman," said the archbishop, stooping to shout in her ear, "The infant's name is Little Daylight." "And Little Daylight it shall be," cried the fairy, in the tone of a dry axle, "and little good shall any of her gifts do her, for I bestow upon her the gift of sleeping all day long, whether she will or not. Ha ha! Hee hee! Hi hi!" Then out started... Oh, look here, you can see... let me flip back over here to OBS. You can see this is their rendering of the witch. There she is. Oh my gosh. Isn't that a thing? Oh my gosh. So she said that. Okay. Then out started the 6th fairy who, of course, the others had arranged should come after the wicked one. Oh, I have to ask your forgiveness for my yawning. Maybe it'll make you sleepy too. Let me read that again. Then out started the 6th fairy who, of course, the others had arranged should come after the wicked one, in order to undo as much as she might. If she sleep all day, she said mournfully, she shall at least wake all night. A nice prospect for her mother and me, thought the poor king, for they loved her far too much to give her up to nurses, especially at night, as most kings and queens do, and are sorry for it afterwards. You spoke before I had done, said the wicked fairy. That's against the law. It gives me another chance. I beg your pardon, said the other fairies all together. She did. I hadn't done laughing, said the crone. I'd only got to hi, and I had to go through ho and hoo. So I decree that if she wakes all night, she shall wax and wane with its mistress, the moon. And what that may mean, I hope her royal parents will live to see. Ho! Hoo-hoo! But out stepped another fairy, for they had been very wise to keep two in reserve, because every fairy knew the trick of one. Until, said the seventh fairy, a prince comes who shall kiss her without knowing it. The wicked fairy made a horrid noise like an angry cat and hobbled away. She could not pretend that she had not finished her speech this time, for she had laughed ho and hoo. I don't know what that means, said the poor king to the seventh fairy. Don't be afraid. The meaning will come with the thing itself, said she. The assembly broke up, miserable enough. The queen at least prepared for a good many sleepless nights, and the lady at the head of the nursery department anything but comfortable in the prospect before her, for of course the queen could not do it all. As for the king, he made up his mind, with what courage he could summon, to meet the demands of the case, but wondered whether he could with any propriety require the First Lord of the Treasury to take a share in the burden laid upon him. I will not attempt to describe what they had to go through for some time, but at last the household settled into a regular system, a very irregular one in some respects. For at certain seasons the palace rang all night with bursts of laughter from little Daylight, whose heart the old fairy's curse could not reach. She was Daylight still, only a little in the wrong place, for she always dropped asleep at the first hint of dawn in the east. But her merriment was of short duration. When the moon was at the full, she was in glorious spirits, and as beautiful as it was possible for a child of her age to be. But as the moon waned, she faded, until at last she was wan and withered like the poorest, sickliest child you might come upon in the streets of a great city, in the arms of a homeless mother. Then the night was quiet as the day, for the little creature lay in her gorgeous cradle night and day with hardly a motion, and indeed at last without even a moan, like one dead. At first they often thought she was dead, but at last they got used to it, and only consulted the almanac to find the moment when she would begin to revive, which, of course, was with the appearance of the silver thread of the crescent moon. Then she would move her lips, and they would give her a little nourishment, and she would grow better and better and better, until for a few days she was splendidly well. When well, she was always merriest out in the moonlight, but even when near her worst, she seemed better when, in warm summer nights, they carried her cradle out into the light of the waning moon. Then in her sleep she would smile the faintest, most pitiful smile. For a long time very few people ever saw her awake. As she grew older she became such a favorite, however, that about the palace there were always some who would contrive to keep awake at night in order to be near her. but she soon began to take every chance of getting away from her nurses and enjoying her moonlight alone. And thus things went on until she was nearly 17 years of age. Her father and mother had by that time got so used to the odd state of things that they had ceased to wonder at them. All their arrangements in reference to the state of Princess Daylight. All their arrangements had reference to the state of Princess Daylight, and it is amazing how things contrive to accommodate themselves. But how any prince was ever to find and deliver her appeared inconceivable. Just a moment, excuse me. Okay. As she grew older, she had grown more and more beautiful, with the sunniest hair and the loveliest eyes of heavenly blue, brilliant and profound as the sky of a June day. But so much more painful and sad was the change as her bad time came on. The more beautiful she was in the full moon, the more withered and worn she did become as the moon waned. At the time at which my story has now arrived, she looked, when the moon was small or gone, like an old woman, exhausted with suffering. This was the more painful that her... Oh, I see. Yeah, forgot my little guide. They didn't have this issue with Wizard of Oz, but I kind of do with this text. I don't know. I think it's kind of how I'm sitting too. But it's a little more... Excuse me. But it's a little more difficult to hold the... Well, I'll try holding it. Okay. So she looks like an old lady. This was the more painful that her appearance was unnatural, for her hair and eyes did not change. Her wan face was both drawn and wrinkled, and had an eager, hungry look. Her skinny hands moved as if wishing, but unable, to lay hold of something. Her shoulders were bent forward, her chest went in, and she stooped as if she were 80 years old. At last she had to be put to bed, and there await the flow of the tide of life. But she grew to dislike being seen, still more being touched by any hands during this season. One lovely summer evening, when the moon lay all but gone upon the verge of the horizon, she vanished from her attendants, and it was only after searching for her a long time in great terror that they found her fast asleep in the forest at the foot of a silver birch, and carried her home. A little way from the palace there was a great open glade, covered with the greenest and softest grass. This was her favorite haunt, for here the full moon shone free and glorious, while through a vista in the trees she could generally see more or less of the dying moon as it crossed the opening. Here she had a little rustic house built for her, and here she mostly resided. None of the court might go there without leave, and her own attendants had learned by this time not to be officious in waiting upon her, so that she was very much at liberty. Whether the good fairies had anything to do with it or not, I cannot tell, but at last Whether the good fairies had anything to do with it or not, I cannot tell, but at last she got into the way of retreating further into the wood every night as the moon waned, so that sometimes they had a great trouble in finding her, but as she was always very angry if they discovered they were watching her, they scarcely dared to do so. At length, one night, they thought they had lost her altogether. It was morning before they found her. Feeble as she had wandered into a thicket a long way from the glade, and there she lay, fast asleep, of course. Although the fame of her beauty and sweetness had gone abroad, yet as everybody knew she was under a bad spell, no king in the neighborhood had any desire to have her for a daughter-in-law. There were serious objections to such a relation. About this time in a neighboring kingdom, in consequence of the wickedness of the nobles, an insurrection took place upon the death of an old king. The greater part of the nobility was massacred, and the young prince was compelled to flee for his life, disguised like a peasant. For some time, until he got out of the country, he suffered much from hunger and fatigue, but when he got into that ruled by the princess's father, and had no longer any fear of being recognized, he fared better, for the people were kind. He did not abandon his disguise, however. One tolerable reason was that he had no other clothes to put on, and another that he had very little money, and did not know where to get any more. Excuse me. There was no good this is funny. There was no good in telling everybody he met that he was a prince, for he felt that a prince ought to be able to get on like other people, else his rank only made a fool of him. He had read of princes setting out upon adventure, and here he was out in similar case, only without having had a choice in the matter. He would go on and see what would come of it. For a day or two he had been walking through the palace wood, and had had next to nothing to eat, when he came upon the strangest little house, inhabited by a very nice, tidy, motherly old woman. This was one of the good fairies. The moment she saw him, she knew quite well who he was, and what was going to come of it, but she was not at liberty to interfere with the orderly march of events. She received him with the kindness she would have shown to any other traveler, and gave him bread and milk, which he thought the most delicious food he had ever tasted, wondering that they did not have it for dinner at the palace sometimes. The old woman pressed him to stay all night. When he awoke, he was amazed to find how well and strong he felt. She would not take any of the money he offered, but begged him, if he found occasion of continuing in the same neighborhood, to return and occupy the same quarters. Now, I'm just going to stop, because I know that in movies, we would kind of nitpick about little details. This is one of those little details for me. What George wrote here is up above at the top, or just in the top of this page even, he said that he had very little money, right? So I don't know how much that is. But then he offers the very little money to the fairy, or he doesn't know that yet, but to this old woman. How little money do you have? Is it like a quarter? Is it 50 cents? I mean, if so, he's generous to offer everything he has in gratitude. I just think those are interesting little tidbits, but we do not know the cost of goods and services in this fictional economy. Anyway, just those little things kind of catch me sometimes in these stories. This is him talking. "Thank you much, good mother," answered the prince, "but there is little chance of that. The sooner I get out of this wood, the better." I don't know that," said the fairy. "What do you mean?" asked the prince. "Why, how should I know?" returned she. "I can't tell," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. "How strangely you talk," said the prince. "Do I?" said the fairy. "Yes, you do," said the prince. "Very well," said the fairy. The prince was not used to being spoken to in this fashion, so he felt a little angry, and turned and walked away. But this did not offend the fairy. She stood at the door of her little house looking after him till the trees hid him quite. Then she said, "At last," and went in. The prince wandered and got nowhere. The sun sank and went out of sight, and he seemed no nearer the end of the wood than ever. He sat down on the fallen tree, ate a bit of bread the old woman had given him, and waited for the moon. For, although he was not much of an astronomer, he knew the moon would rise sometime, because he had risen the night before. Up she came. Let me read that again. He sat down on a fallen tree, ate a bit of bread the old woman had given him, and waited for the moon. For although he was not much of an astronomer, he knew the moon would rise sometime, because she had risen the night before. Up she came, slow and slow, but of a good size, pretty nearly round indeed. Whereupon, greatly refreshed with this piece of bread, he got up and went, he knew not whither. After walking a considerable distance, he thought he was coming to the outside of the forest, but when he reached what he thought the last of it, he found himself only upon the edge of a great open space in it, covered with grass. The moon shone very bright, and he thought he had never seen a more lovely spot. Still it looked dreary because of its loneliness, for he could not see the house at the other side. He sat down weary again, and gazed into the glade. He had not seen so much room for several days. All at once he espied something in the middle of the grass. What could it be? It moved. It came nearer. Was it a human creature gliding across? A girl dressed in white, gleaming in the moonshine? She came nearer and nearer. He crept behind a tree and watched, wondering. It must be some strange being of the wood, a nymph whom the moonlight and the warm, dusky air had enticed from her tree. But when she came close to where he stood, he no longer doubted she was human, for he had caught sight of her sunny hair, and her clear blue eyes, and the loveliest face and form that he had ever seen. All at once she began singing like a nightingale, and dancing to her own music, with her eyes ever turned towards the moon. She passed close to where he stood, dancing on by the edge of the trees and away in a great circle towards the other side, until he could see but a spot of white in the yellowish green of the moonlit grass. But when he feared it would vanquish quite, the spot grew and became a figure once more. She approached him again, singing and dancing and waving her arms over her head until She approached him again and became... I don't know why I'm having a hard time with this. Oh, I see it. I see it skipping a line. She approached him and became a figure... No, golly gee. She approached him again, singing and dancing and waving her arms over her head until she had completed the circle. Just opposite the tree she stood, ceased her song. Just opposite his... I'm just suddenly, I know I had dinner, but suddenly, really tired. You know what I'm saying? How that comes on real quick? I just felt woo, like you're slowing down and pulling up to a red light. That's what I feel like woo, like that. Just opposite his tree she stood, ceased her song, dropped her arms, and broke out into a long, clear laugh, musical as a brook. Then, as if tired, she threw herself on the grass and lay gazing at the moon. The prince was almost afraid to breathe lest he should startle her and she should vanish from his sight. As to venturing near her, that never came into his head. She had lain for an hour or longer when the prince began to doubt concerning her. Oh, I see. She had lain for an hour or longer when the prince began again to doubt concerning her. Perhaps she was but a vision of his own fancy, or was she a spirit of the wood after all? If so, he too would haunt the wood, glad to have lost kingdom and everything for the hope of being near her. He would build him a hut in the forest, and there he would live for the purest chance of seeing her again. Upon nights like this, at least she would come out and bask in the moonlight, and make his soul blessed. But while he thus dreamed, she sprang to her feet, turned her face full to the moon, and began singing as if she would draw her down from the sky by the power of her entrancing voice. She looked more beautiful than ever. Again she began dancing to her own music, and danced away into the distance. Once more she returned in a similar manner. Once more she returned in a similar manner, but although he was watching as eagerly as before, what with fatigue and with gazing, once more she returned in a similar manner, but although he was watching as eagerly as before, what with fatigue and what with gazing, he fell fast asleep before she came near him. When he awoke, it was broad daylight, and the princess was nowhere. Where did she go? I don't know. I actually read this story before, so I do know where she went. A couple clicks. All right back to it. He could not leave the place. What if she should come the next night? He would gladly endure a day's hunger to see her yet again. He would buckle his belt quite tight. He walked round the glade to see if he could discover any prints of her feet, but the grass was so short, and her steps had been so light, that she had not left a single trace behind her. Oh, I wanted to show you to this lovely... the best part of this picture, I can't really see what the... It's like, do you see the frog? The frog down there, isn't that fun? Anyway, that's fun. Okay. He walked halfway round the wood without seeing anything to account for her presence. Then he spied a lovely little house with thatched roof and low eaves, surrounded by an exquisite garden, with doves and peacocks walking in it. Of course, this must be where the gracious lady, who loved the moonlight, lived. Forgetting his appearance, he walked towards the door, determined to make inquiries. But as he passed a little pond full of gold and silver fishes, he caught sight of himself, and turned to find the door to the kitchen. There he knocked and asked for a piece of bread. The good-natured cook brought him in and gave him an excellent breakfast, with which the prince found nothing the worse for being served in the kitchen. While he ate, he talked with his entertainer, and learned that this was the favorite retreat of the Princess Daylight. But he learned nothing more, both because he was afraid of seeming inquisitive, and because the cook did not choose to be heard talking about her mistress to a peasant lad who had begged for his breakfast. As he rose to take his leave, it occurred to him that he might not be so far from the old woman's cottage as he had thought, and he asked the cook whether she knew anything of such a place, describing it as well as he could. She said she knew it well enough, adding with a smile, "It's there you're going, is it?" "Yes, it's not that far off. It's not more than 3 miles. But mind what you are about, you know." Why do you say that? If you're after any mischief, she'll make you repent it." "The best thing that could happen under the circumstances," remarked the prince. "What do you mean by that?" asked the cook. "Why, it stands to reason," answered the prince, "that if you wish to do anything wrong, the best thing for you is to be made to repent of it." "I see," said the cook. "Well, I think you may venture. She's a good old soul." "Which way does it lie from here?" asked the prince. She gave him full instructions, and he left with her many thanks. Being now refreshed, however, the prince did not go back to the cottage that day. He remained in the forest, amusing himself as best he could, but awaiting anxiously for the night, in the hope that the princess would appear again. Nor was he disappointed, for directly the moon rose, he spied a glimmering shape far across the glade. As it drew nearer, he saw it was she indeed, not dressed in white before, in a pale blue like the sky. Not sure what emphasis is really meant in that sentence. As it drew nearer, he saw it was she indeed, not dressed in white as before, in a pale blue like the sky. She looked lovelier still. I don't think that's quite it, but I think that's close. What do you think? As it drew nearer, he saw it was she indeed, not dressed in white as before, in a pale blue like the sky, she looked lovelier still. He thought it was that the blue suited her yet better than the white. He did not know that she was really more beautiful because the moon was nearer the full. These back-to-back sentences, both of these, see, I would put the emphasis there on, I know I'm kind of breaking the rhythm, but maybe on thought. He thought it was that the blue suited her yet better than the white. He did not know that she was really more beautiful because the moon was nearer the full. In fact, the next night was full moon, and the princess would then be at the zenith of her loveliness. The prince feared for some time that she was not coming near his hiding place that night, but the circles in her dance ever widened as the moon rose, until at last they embraced the whole glade, and she came still closer to the trees where he was hiding than she had come the night before. He was entranced with her loveliness, for it was indeed a marvelous thing. All night long he watched her, but dared not go near her. He would have been ashamed of watching her too, had he not become almost incapable of thinking of anything but how beautiful she was. He watched the whole night long, and saw that, as the moon went down, she retreated in smaller and smaller circles, until at last he could see her no more. Weary as he was, he set out for the old woman's cottage, where he arrived just in time for her breakfast, which she shared with him. He then went to bed and slept for many hours. When he awoke, the sun was down, and he departed in great anxiety lest he should lose a glimpse of the lovely vision. But whether it was by the machinations of the swamp fairy, or merely that it is one thing to go and another to return by the same road, he lost his way. I shall not attempt to describe his misery when the moon rose and he saw nothing but trees, trees, trees. She was high in the heavens before he reached the glade. Then indeed his troubles vanished, for there was the princess coming dancing towards him, in a dress that shone like gold, and with shoes that glimmered through the glass. Then indeed his troubles vanished, for there was the princess coming this is a long sentence. They're longer coming up. Then indeed his troubles vanished, for there was the princess coming dancing towards him, in a dress that shone like gold, and with shoes that glimmered through the grass like fireflies. She was, of course, still more beautiful than before. Like an embodied sunbeam she passed him, and danced away into the distance. Before she returned in her circle, clouds had begun to gather about the moon. The wind rose, the trees moaned, and their lighter branches leaned all one way before it. The prince feared that the princess would go in, and he should see her no more than that night. But she came dancing on more jubilant than ever, her golden dress and her sunny hair streaming out upon the blast, waving her arms towards the moon, and in the exuberance of her delight, ordering the clouds away from her face. The prince could hardly believe she was not a creature of the elements, after all. By the time she had completed another circle... Try that again. By the time she had completed another... Oof. You feel that? Completed another. Tadana. That's how that breaks down. Completed another. Tadana. By the time she had completed another circle, the clouds... But you don't want to say it like that. By the time she had completed another circle, the clouds had gathered deep, and there were growlings of distant thunder. Just as she passed the tree where he stood, a flash of lightning blinded him for a moment, and when he saw again to his horror, just as she passed the tree where he stood, a flash of lightning blinded him for a moment, and when he saw again to his horror, the princess lay on the ground. He darted to her, thinking she had been struck, but when she heard him coming, she was on her feet in a moment. "What do you want?" she asked. "I beg your pardon. I thought... The lightning," said the prince, hesitating. "There is nothing the matter," said the princess, waving him off rather haughtily. The poor prince turned and walked towards the wood. "Come back," said Daylight. "I like you. You do what you were told. Are you good?" "Not so good as I should like to be," said the prince. "Then go and grow better," said the princess. Again the disappointed prince turned and went. "Come back," said the princess. He obeyed and stood before her, waiting. "Can you tell me what the sun is like?" she asked. "No," he answered. "But where's the good of asking what you know?" "But I don't know," she rejoined. "Why, everybody knows." "That's the very thing. I'm not everybody. I've never seen the sun." "Then you can't know what it's like till you see it." "I think you must be a prince," said the princess. "Do I look like one?" said the prince. "I can't quite say that." "Then why do you think so?" "Because you both do what you are told and speak the truth." "Is the sun so very bright?" "As bright as the lightning." "But it doesn't go out like that, does it?" "Oh, no. It shines like the moon, rises and sets like the moon, is much the same shape as the moon, only so bright that you can't look at it for a moment." "But I would look at it," said the princess. "But you couldn't," said the prince. "But I could," said the princess. "Why don't you then?" "Because I can't." "Why can't you?" "Because I can't wake. I shall never wake until..." Here she hid her face in her hands, turned away, and walked in the slowest, stateliest manner towards the house. The prince ventured to follow her at a little distance, but she turned and made a repellent gesture, which, like a true gentleman prince, he obeyed at once. He waited a long time, but as she did not come near him again, and as the night had now cleared, he set off at last for the old woman's cottage. It was long past midnight when he reached it, but, to his surprise, the old woman was paring potatoes at the door. Fairies are fond of doing odd things. Indeed, however they may dissemble, the night is always their day, and so it is with all who have fairy blood in them. "Why, what are you doing there this time of night, mother?" said the prince, for that was the kind way in which any young man in his country would address a woman who was much older than himself. "Getting your supper ready, my son," she answered. "Oh, I don't want any supper," said the prince. "Ah, you've seen daylight," said she. "I've seen a princess who never saw it," said the prince. "Do you like her?" asked the fairy. "Oh, don't I?" said the prince. "More than you would believe, mother." "A fairy can believe anything that ever was or ever could be," said the old woman. "Then are you a fairy?" asked the prince. "Yes," said she. "Then what do you do for things not to believe?" asked the prince. "There's plenty of them. Everything that never was, nor ever could be." "Plenty, I grant you," said the prince. "But do you believe there could be a princess who never saw the daylight? Do you believe that now?" This the prince said, not that he doubted the princess, but that he wanted the fairy to tell him more. She was too old a fairy, however, to be caught so easily. Of all people, fairies must not tell secrets. Besides, she's a princess. "Well, I'll tell you a secret. I am a prince." "I know that." "How do you know it?" "By the curl of the third eyelash on your left eyelid." Which corner do you count from?" "That's a secret." "Another secret? Well, at least if I am a prince, there could be no harm in telling me about a princess. It's just princes I can't tell." "There ain't any more of them, are there?" said the prince. "What? You don't think you're the only prince in the world, do you?" "Oh, dear, no, not at all. But I know there's one too many just at present. Except the princess." Yes, that's it," said the fairy. "What's it?" asked the prince. But he could get nothing more out of the fairy, and had to go to bed unanswered, which was something of a trial. Now the wicked fairies will not be bound by the laws which the good fairies obey, and this always seems to give the bad the advantage over the good, for they use means to gain their ends which the others will not. But it is all of no consequence, for what they do never succeeds, nay, in the end it brings about the very thing they are trying to prevent. So you see that somehow, for all their cleverness, wicked fairies are dreadfully stupid, for although from the beginning of the world they have really helped instead of thwarting the good fairies, not one of them is a bit wiser for it. She will try the bad thing just as they all did before her, and succeed no better, of course. The prince had so far stolen a march upon the swamp fairy that she did not know he was in the neighborhood until after he had seen the princess those 3 times. Before she knew it, she consoled herself by thinking that the princess must be far too proud and too modest for any young man to venture even to speak to her before he had seen her 6 times at least. But there was even less danger than the wicked fairy thought, for however much the princess might desire to be set free, she was dreadfully afraid of the wrong prince. Now, however, the fairy was going to do all she could. I'm sure she is. My goodness. She so contrived it by her deceitful spells that the next night the prince could not by any endeavor find his way to the glade. It would take me too long to tell you her tricks. They would be amusing to us, who know that they could not do any harm, but they were something other than amusing to the poor prince. He wandered about the forest till daylight, and then fell fast asleep. The same thing occurred for 7 following days, during which neither could he find the good fairy's cottage. After the 3rd quarter of the moon, however, the bad fairy thought she might be at ease about the affair for a fortnight at least, for there was no chance of the prince wishing to kiss the princess during that period. So, the first day of the 4th quarter he did find the cottage, and the next day he found the glade. For nearly another week he haunted it, but the princess never came. I have little doubt she was on the farther edge of it some part of every night, but at this period she always wore black, and, there being little or no light, the prince never saw her. Nor would he have known her if he had seen her. How could he have taken the worn, decrepit creature she was now for the glorious Princess Daylight? At last, one night when there was no moon at all, he ventured near the house. There he heard voices talking, although it was past midnight, for her women were in considerable uneasiness, because the one whose turn it was to watch her had fallen asleep, and had not seen which way she went, and this was a night when she would probably wander very far. Describing a circle which did not touch the open glade at all, but stretched away from the back of the house deep into that side of the forest, a part of which the prince knew nothing. When he understood from what they said that she had disappeared, and that she must have gone somewhere in the said direction, he plunged at once into the wood to see if he could find her. For hours he roamed with nothing to guide him but the vague notion of a circle which on one side bordered on the house, for so much he had picked up from the talk he had overheard. It was getting toward the dawn, but as yet there was no streak of light in the sky, when he came to a great birch tree, and sat down weary at the foot of it. While he sat, very miserable, you may be sure, full of fear for the princess, and wondering how her attendants could take it so quietly, he bethought himself that it would not be a bad plan to light a fire, which, if she were anywhere near, would attract her. This he managed with a tinder box, with which the good fairy had given him. Let me do that again, it's a little sloppy there. While he sat, very miserable, you may be sure, full of fear for the princess, and wondering how her attendants could take it so quietly, he bethought himself that it would not be a bad plan to light a fire, which, if she were anywhere near, would attract her. This he managed with the tinder box which the good fairy had given him. It was just beginning to blaze up when he heard a moan, which seemed to come from the other side of the tree. He sprung to his feet, but his heart throbbed so that he had to lean for a moment against the tree before he could move. When he got round, there lay a human form in a little dark heap on the earth. There was light enough from his fire to show it was not the princess. He lifted it to his arms, hardly heavier than a child, and carried it to the flame. The countenance was that of an old woman, but it had a fearfully strange look. A black hood concealed her hair, and her eyes were closed. He laid her down as comfortably as he could, chafed her hands, put a little cordial from a bottle, also the gift of a fairy, into her mouth, took off his coat and wrapped it around her, and in short, did the best he could. In a little while she opened her eyes and looked at him, so pitifully. The tears rose and flowed down her gray, wrinkled cheeks, but she never said a word. She closed her eyes again, but the tears kept on flowing, and her whole appearance was so utterly pitiful that the prince was very near crying too. He begged her to tell him what was the matter, promising to do all he could to help her, but still she did not speak. He thought she was dying, and took her in his arms again to carry her to the princess's house, where he thought the good-natured cook might be able to do something for her. When he lifted her, the tears flowed yet faster, and she gave such a sad moan that it went to his very heart. "Mother, mother," he said, "poor mother," and kissed her on the withered lips. She started, and what eyes they were that opened upon him! But he did not see them, for it was still very dark, and he had enough to do to make his way through the trees towards the house. Just as he approached the door, feeling more tired than he could have imagined possible, she was such a little old thing, she began to move, and became so restless that, unable to carry her a moment longer, he thought to lay her on the grass. But she stood upright on her feet. Her hood had dropped, and her hair fell about her. The first gleam of the morning was caught on her face. That face was bright as the never-aging dawn, and her eyes were lovely as the sky of darkest blue. The prince recoiled in overmastering wonder. It was Daylight herself, whom he had brought up from the forest. He fell at her feet, nor dared look up until she lay her hand upon his head. He rose then. "You kissed me when I was an old woman. There, I kiss you when I am a young princess," murmured Daylight. "Is that the sun coming?" What a great story. What did you think? Wow. I really hear a lot of layers. I don't want to get too deep into it, but I really like this story. First of all, it's like the most classic of classics, right? Like, it just has such that classic feel. Prince, princess, Sleeping Beauty kind of things with the sleeping, but it's actually more kind of photogenic terrace, related, because it's, got to do with two people who are ostensibly bound to different times of the day or to different light sources. And MacDonald plays with that a lot here and in Photogenic Terrace. Wow. And it reminds me, it's, again, Sleeping Beauty, it reminds me of when Maleficent appears to curse Aurora, right? And she casts the curse and all that, and what's going to happen? Where are we? What's going on? What I think is, I'll get on to the next thing here, but what I think is really cool about the difference between the two stories, between between Sleeping Beauty and Little Daylight, is that in Sleeping Beauty, the prince, he has the opportunity to show forth his quality, right, through action. It's what he does. That defines who he is and why he's worthy to kiss Aurora and, be the king, I guess, or whatever, right? I think what's really beautiful and clever about this story is, remember, again, she, the bad fairy, or the swamp witch, or whatever they want to call her, she thought that by saying that she was making it more difficult, right? And that's what George covers. Is he says that they think they're making it harder, but in fact it actually is beneficial to to the overall good, in that it's not just that a prince kisses a princess, right? It's that a prince has to kiss a princess who is magically transformed into an old woman, an 80-year-old woman, decrepit, no energy, barely hanging on to life. He has to kiss her, not knowing that she is a princess. You can't, and you can't. I mean, he doesn't know this, of course. Remember, she almost tells him, but then does not. Right? He doesn't know this. So what you have is you have a true hero. You have a hero who will do the right thing for the truest reasons. I think that's marvelous. I think that's marvelous. That the conditions of the spell to be broken require a true hero's heart. Really a heart of compassion. This reflects Catholic teaching as well. Loving someone for the sake of the other. Not because of who they are, but because they are. Because they're a person. So, cheers to George MacDonald, man. What a great, great story. I will admit, I feel pretty zapped. I know that the history of Photogen and Nectaris is a little bit longer. I'm being honest. I don't know if I'm going to make it a lot longer. Okay, let's definitely do the Castle of Parable. That's shorter, and then I'll see how I feel. Okay. Hey, if you're watching, you're wondering why am I here? What's going on? We're reading tonight. George MacDonald, outstanding. But I'm also trying to raise money for Children's Miracle Network hospitals. If you would punch in that link down below, www.extralife.org/participant/ET. You can take a look, learn more about Extra Life and the extraordinary work they're doing supporting Children's Miracle Network hospitals. God darn it. Boy, would I just be so pleased and grateful if you would even think about making a donation tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, let me look over here real quick. See what we got going. Excuse me. Sorry. I will say I do feel it's starting to clear up a little bit, but we'll see. I also wouldn't mind having one, for later. Okay. Let me reset my Audacity. I don't think I'm going to keep that, but I actually recorded it once before, Little Daylight, and it's a little bit better. So the recording, I don't think the live thing is the way to do it. I don't think that's the way. I can also cut down on my room noise when I record offline. So, yeah. Okay, let me just get the new project running. No one's in the chat, no problem. You can send a message. I'm glad this is the time to do it right now. But when I get started again, then I'm gonna be off the grid. Test 1 2 test. Okay, here we go. Okay. The Castle, a Parable, written by George MacDonald, read by Eric Thompson. The Castle, a Parable is reprinted from Adela Cathcart in 1864. The Castle, a Parable is in the public domain. On the top of a high cliff, forming part of the base of a great mountain, stood a lofty castle. When or how it was built no man knew, nor could anyone pretend to understand its architecture. Everyone who looked upon it felt that it was lordly and noble, and where one part seemed not to agree with another, the wise and modest dared not to call them incongruous, but presumed that the whole might be constructed on some higher principle of architecture than they yet understood. What helped them to this conclusion was that no one had ever seen the whole of the edifice, that, even of the portion best known, some part or other was always wrapped in thick folds of mist from the mountain, and that, when the sun shone upon the mountain... Let me try that again. What helped them to this conclusion was that no one had ever seen the whole of the edifice, that, even of the portion best known, some part or other was always wrapped in thick folds of mist from the mountain, and that, when the sun shone upon this mist, the parts of the building that appeared through the vaporous veil were strangely glorified in their indistinctness, so that they seemed to belong to some aerial abode in the land of the sunset, and the beholders could hardly tell whether they had ever seen them before, or whether they were now for the time partially revealed. Nor, although it was inhabited, could certain information be procured as to its internal construction. Those who dwelt in it often discovered rooms they had never entered before, yea, once or twice, whole suites of apartments, of which only dim legends had been handed down from former times. Here's a great illustration. This book, really great illustrations. What do you think of that? I love that. Outstanding. Some of them expected to find, one day, secret places filled with treasures of wondrous jewels, amongst which they hoped to light upon Solomon's ring, which had for ages disappeared from the earth, but which had controlled the spirits, and the possession of which made a man simply what a man should be, the king of the world. Now and then a narrow, winding stair, hitherto untrodden, would bring them forth on a new turret, whence new prospects of the circumjacent country were spread out before them. How many more of these there might be, or how much loftier, no one could tell, nor could the foundations of the castle in the rock on which it was built be determined with the smallest approach to precision. Those of the family who had given themselves to exploring in that direction found such a labyrinth of vaults and passages, and endless successions of down-going stairs, out of one underground space into a yet lower, that they came to the conclusion that at least the whole mountain was perforated and honeycombed in this fashion. They had a dim consciousness, too, of the presence, in those awful regions, of beings whom they could not comprehend. Once they came upon the brink of a great black gulf, in which the eye could see nothing but darkness. They recoiled in horror, for the conviction flashed upon them that the gulf went down into the very central spaces of the earth, of which they had hitherto been wandering only in the upper crust, nay, that the seething blackness before them had relations mysterious, and beyond human comprehension, with the far-off voids of space, into which the stars dare not enter. At the foot of the cliff whereon the castle stood lay a deep lake, inaccessible save by a few avenues, being surrounded on all sides with precipices, which made the water look very black, although it was as pure as the night sky. From a door in the castle, which was not to be otherwise entered, a broad flight of steps cut in the rock went down to the lake, and disappeared below its surface. Some thought the steps went to the very bottom of the water. Now in this castle there dwelt a large family of brothers and sisters. They had never seen their father or mother. The younger had been educated by the elder, and these by an unseen care and ministration, about the sources of which they had somehow or other troubled themselves very little. For what people are accustomed to, they regard as coming from nobody, as if help and progress and joy and love were the natural crops of chaos or old night. But tradition said that one day, it was utterly uncertain when, their father would come and leave them no more, for he was still alive, though where he lived nobody knew. In the meantime, all the rest had to obey their eldest brother and listen to all his counsels. But almost all the family was very fond of liberty, as they called it, and liked to run up and down, hither and thither, roving about, with neither law nor order, just as they pleased. So they could not endure their brother's tyranny, as they called it. At one time they said he was the only one of themselves, and therefore they would not obey him. At another, that he was not like them and could not understand them, and therefore they would not obey him. Yet sometimes, when he came and looked them full in the face, they were terrified and dared not disobey, for he was stately and stern and strong. Not one of them loved him heartily except the eldest sister, who was very beautiful and silent, and whose eyes shone as if light lay somewhere deep behind them. Even she, although she loved him, thought him very hard sometimes, for when he had once said a thing plainly, he could not be persuaded to think it over again. So even she forgot him sometimes and went her own ways, and enjoyed herself without him. Most of them regarded him as a sort of watchman, whose business it was to keep them in order, and so they were. Most of them regarded him as a sort of watchman, whose business it was to keep them in order, and so they were indignant and disliked him. Yet they all had a secret feeling that they ought to be subject to him, and after any particular act of disregard, none of them could think, with any peace, of the old story about the return of their father to his house. But indeed they never thought much about it, or about their father at all. For how could those who cared so little for their brother, whom they saw every day, care for their father, whom they had never seen? One chief cause of complaint against him was that he interfered with their favorite studies and pursuits, whereas he only sought to make them give up trifling with earnest things, and seek for truth, and not for amusement, from the many wonders around them. He did not want them to turn to other studies or to eschew pleasures, but, in those studies, to seek the highest things most, and the other things in proportion to their true worth and nobleness. Sorry, are you hearing how long these sentences are? I, I cannot believe it. Okay. This could not fail to be distasteful to those who did not care for what was higher than they, and so matters went on for a time. They thought they could do better without their brother, and their brother knew they could not do at all without him, and tried to fulfill the charge committed into his hands. At length, one day, for the thought seemed to strike them simultaneously, they conferred together about giving a great entertainment in their grandest rooms to any of their neighbors who chose to come, or indeed to any inhabitants of the earth or air who would come visit them. They were too proud to reflect that some company might defile even the dwellers in what was undoubtedly the finest palace on the face of the earth. But what made the thing worse was that the old tradition said that these rooms were to be kept entirely for the use of the owner of the castle, and indeed, whenever they entered them, such was the effect of their loftiness and grandeur upon their minds, that they always thought of the old story, and could not help believing it. Nor would the brother permit them to forget it now, but, appearing suddenly amongst them, when they had no expectation of being interrupted by him, he rebuked them, both for the indiscriminate nature of their invitation, and for some intention of introducing anyone, not to speak of some who would doubtless make their appearance on the evening in question, into the rooms kept sacred for the use of the unknown father. But by this time their talk with each other had so excited their expectations of enjoyment, which had previously been strong enough, that anger sprung up within them at the thought of being deprived of their hopes, and they looked each other in the eyes, and the look said, "We are many, and he is one. Let us get rid of him, for he is always finding fault and thwarting us in the most innocent pleasures, as if we would wish to do anything wrong." So without a word spoken, they rushed upon him, and although he was stronger than any of them and struggled hard at first, yet they overcame him at last. Indeed, some of them thought he yielded to their violence long before they had mastery of him, and this very submission terrified the more tender-hearted among them. However, they bound him, carried him down many stairs, and, having remembered an iron staple in the wall of a certain vault, with a thick rusty nail attached to it, they bore him thither, and made the chain fast around him. There they left him, shutting the great gnarring brazen door of the vault, as they departed for the upper regions of the castle. Now all was in a tumult of preparation. Everyone was talking of the coming festivity, but no one spoke of the deed they had done. A sudden paleness overspread the face, now of one, and now of another, but it passed away, and no one took any notice of it. They only plied the task of the moment the more energetically. Messengers were sent far and near, not to individuals or families, but publishing in all places of discourse a general invitation to any who chose to come on a certain day, and partake for certain succeeding days of the hospitality of the dwellers in the castle. Many were the preparations immediately begun for complying with the invitation, but the noblest of their neighbors refused to appear, not from pride, but because of the unsuitableness and carelessness of such a mode. With some of them it was an old condition in the tenure of one of their estates that they should go to no one's dwelling except visited in person and expressly solicited. Others, knowing what sorts of persons would be there, and that, from a certain physical antipathy, they could scarcely breathe in their company, made up their minds at once not to go. Yet multitudes, many of them beautiful and innocent as well as gay, resolved to appear. Meanwhile the great rooms of the castle were got in readiness, that is, they proceeded to deface them with decorations, for there was a solemnity and stateliness about them in their ordinary condition, which was at once felt to be unsuitable for the light-hearted company so soon to move about in them with the same. And again, you mess up once and you got to read this whole monstrous thing again. Meanwhile, the great rooms of the castle were got in readiness. That is, they proceeded to deface them with decorations, for there was a solemnity and stateliness about them in their ordinary condition, which was at once felt to be unsuitable for the light-hearted company so soon to move about in them with the self-same carelessness with which men walk abroad within the great heavens and hills and clouds. One day, while the workmen were busy, the eldest sister, of whom I have already spoken, happened to enter, she knew not why. Suddenly the great idea of the mighty halls dawned upon her, and filled her soul. The so-called decorations vanished from her view, and she felt as if she stood in her father's presence. She was at once elevated and humbled, as suddenly the idea faded and fled, and she beheld but the gaudy festoons and draperies and paintings which disfigured the grandeur. She wept and sped away. Now it was too late to interfere, and things must take their course. She would have been but a Cassandra prophetess to those who saw but the pleasure before them. She had not been present when her brother was imprisoned, and indeed for some days had been so wrapped in her own business that she had taken but little heed of anything that was going on. But they all expected her to show herself when the company was gathered, and they had applied to her for advice at various times during the operations. At length the expected hour was arrived, and the company began to assemble. It was a warm summer evening. The dark lake reflected the rose-colored clouds in the west, and through the flush rode many gaily painted boats, with various colored flags, towards the massy rock on which the castle stood. I imagine that in Hogwarts when all the boats are, you know what I'm saying? But more fog, apparently. The trees and flowers seemed already asleep, and breathing forth their sweet dream breath. What a great sentence. Come on, George. Laughter and low voices rose from the breast of the lake to the ears of the youths and maidens looking forth expectant from the lofty windows. They went down to the broad platform at the top of the stairs in front of the door to receive their visitors. By degrees the festivities of the evening commenced. The same smiles flew forth both at eyes and lips, darting like beams throughout the gathering crowd. Music from unseen sources now rolled in billows, now crept in ripples through the sea of air that filled the lofty rooms. And in the dancing halls, when hand took hand, and form and motion were molded and swayed by the indwelling music, it governed not these alone, but, as the ruling spirit of the place, every new burst of music for a new dance swept before it a new and accordant odor, and dyed the flames that glowed in the lofty lamps with a new and accordant stain. Yo, they got some effects going, yo, in this party. The floors bent beneath the feet of the time-keeping dancers. But twice in the evening some of the inmates started, and the pallor occasionally common to the household overspread their faces, for they felt underneath them a counter-motion to the dance, as if the floor rose slightly to answer their feet. And all the time their brother lay below in the dungeon, like John the Baptist in the castle of Herod, with the lords and captains sat around, and the daughter of Herodias danced before them. Oof. Let me take that again. The floors bent beneath the feet of the time-keeping dancers, but twice in the evening some of the inmates started, and the pallor occasionally common to the household overspread their faces, for they felt underneath them a counter-motion to the dance, as if the floor rose slightly to answer their feet. And all the time their brother lay below in the dungeon, like John the Baptist in the castle of Herod, when the lords and captains sat around, and the daughter of Herodias danced before them. Outside, all around the castle, brooded the dark night unheeded, for the clouds had come up from all sides and were crowding together overhead. In the unfrequent pauses of the music, they might have heard now and then the gusty rush of a lonely wind, coming and going and no one could know whence or whither, born and dying unexpected and unregarded. But when the festivities were at their height, when the external and passing confidence which is produced between superficial natures by a common pleasure was at the full, a sudden crash of thunder quelled the music, and the thunder quells the noise of the A sudden crash of thunder quelled the music, as the thunder quells the noise of the uplifted sea. The windows were driven in, and torrents of rain, carried in the folds of a rushing wind, poured into the halls. The lights were swept away, and the great rooms, now dark within, were darkened yet by more. The lights were swept away, and the great rooms, now dark within, were darkened yet more by the dazzling shoots of flame from the vault of blackness overhead. Those that ventured to look out of the windows saw, in the blue brilliancy of the quick-following jets of lightning, the lake at the foot of the rock, ordinarily so still and so dark, lighted up, not on the surface only, but down to half its depth, so that, as it tossed in the wind like a tortured sea of writhing flames, or incandescent half-molten serpents of brass, they could not tell whether a strong phosphorescence did not issue from the transparent body of the waters, as if earth and sky lightened together, one consenting source of flaming utterance. That is a mouthful. Outstanding. Sad was the condition of the late plastic mass of living form that had flowed into shape at the will and law of the music. Broken into individuals, the common transfusing spirit withdrawn, they stood drenched, cold and benumbed, with clinging garments, light, order, harmony, purpose departed, and chaos restored. The issuings of life turned back on their sources, chilly and dead. And in every heart reigned that falsest of despairing convictions, that this was the only reality, and that was but a dream. The eldest sister stood with clasped hands and down-bent head, shivering and speechless, as if waiting for something to follow. Nor did she wait long. A terrible flash and thunder peal made the castle rock, and in the pausing silence that followed, her quick sense heard the rattling of a chain far off, deep down, and soon the sound of heavy footsteps, accompanied with the clanking of iron, reached her ear. She felt that her brother was at hand, even in the darkness, and amidst the bellowing of another deep-bosomed cloud monster. She knew that he had entered the room. A moment after, a continuous pulsation of angry blue light began, which, lasting for some moments, revealed him standing amidst them, gaunt, haggard, and motionless, his hair and beard untrimmed, his face ghastly, his eyes large and hollow. The light seemed to gather around him as a center. Indeed, some believed that it throbbed and radiated from his person, and not from the stormy heavens above them. The light had rent the wall of his prison, and released the iron staple of his chain, which he had wound about him like a girdle. In his hand he carried an iron fetter bar, which he had found on the floor of the vault. More terrified at his aspect than at all the violence of the storm, the visitors, with many a shriek and cry, rushed out into the tempestuous night. By degrees the storm died away. Its last flash revealed the forms of the brothers and sisters lying prostrate, with their faces on the floor, and that fearful shape standing motionless amidst them still. Morning dawned, and there they lay, and there he stood. But at a word from him they arose and went about their various duties, though listlessly enough. The eldest sister was the last to rise, and when she did, it was only by a terrible effort that she was able to reach her room, where she fell again on the floor. There she remained lying for days. The brother caused the doors of the great suite of rooms to be closed, leaving them just as they were, with all the childish adornment scattered about, and the rain still falling in through the shattered windows. Thus let them lie, said he, till the rain and frost have cleansed them of paint and drapery. No storm can hurt the pillars and arches of these halls. The hours of this day went heavily. The storm was gone, but the rain was left. The passion had departed, but the tears remained behind. Dull and dark the low misty clouds brooded over the castle and the lake, and shut out all the neighborhood. Even if they had climbed to the loftiest known turret, they would have found it swathed in a garment of clinging vapor, affording no refreshment to the eye and no hope to the heart. There was one lofty tower that rose sheer 100 feet above the rest, and from which the fog could have been seen lying in a gray mass beneath. But that tower had not yet been discovered, nor another close beside it, the top of which was never seen, nor could be, for the highest clouds of heaven clustered continually around it. The rain fell continuously, though not heavily, without, and within too. There were clouds from which dropped the tears which are the rain of the Spirit. All the good of life seemed for the time departed, and their souls lived but as leafless trees that had forgotten the joy of the summer, and whom no wind prophetic of spring had yet visited. They moved about mechanically, and had not strength enough left to wish to die. Try it again. They moved about mechanically, and had not strength enough left to wish to die. The next day the clouds were higher, and a little wind blew through such loopholes in the turrets as the false improvements of the inmates had not yet filled with glass, shutting out, as the storm, so the serene visitings of the heavens. Throughout the day the brother took various opportunities of addressing a gentle command, now to one and now to another of his family. It was obeyed in silence. The wind blew fresher through the loopholes and the shattered windows of the great rooms, and found its way, by unknown passages, to faces and eyes hot with weeping. It cooled and blessed them. When the sun arose the next day, it was a clear sky. By degrees everything fell into the regularity of subordination. With the subordination came increase of freedom. The steps of the more youthful of the family were heard on the stairs and in the corridors, more light and quick than ever before. Their brother had lost the terrors of aspect produced by his confinement, and his commands were issued more gently, and oftener with a smile, than in all their previous history. By degrees his presence was universally felt through the house. It was no surprise to anyone at his studies to see him by his side when he lifted up his eyes, though he had not before known that he was in the room. And although some dread still remained, it was rapidly vanishing before the advances of a firm friendship. Without immediately ordering their labors, he always influenced them, and often altered their direction and objects. The change soon evident in the household was remarkable. A simpler, nobler expression was visible on all their countenances. The voices of the men were deeper, and yet seemed by their very depth more feminine than before, while the voices of the women were softer and sweeter, and at the same time more full and decided. Now the eyes had often an expression as if their sight was absorbed in the gaze of the inward eyes, and when the eyes of two met, there passed between those eyes the utterance of a conviction that both meant the same thing. But the change was, of course, to be seen more clearly, though not more evidently, in individuals. Sorry. One of the brothers, for instance, was very fond of astronomy. He had his... Oh, here it is. Excuse me, I'm really sorry about that. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. It's okay. Oh, golly. Okay. One of the brothers, for instance, was very fond of astronomy. He had his observatory on a lofty tower, which stood pretty clear of the others, towards the north and east. But hitherto, his astronomy, as he had called it, had been more of the character of astrology. Often, too, he might have been seen directing a heaven-searching telescope to catch the rapid transit of a fiery shooting star, belonging together to the earthly atmosphere and not to the serene heavens. He had to learn that the signs of the air are not the signs of the skies. Nay, once his brother surprised him in the act of examining through his longest tube a patch of burning heath upon a distant hill. But now he was diligent from morning till night in the study of the laws of the truth that has to do with the stars, and when the curtain of the sunlight was about to rise from before the heavenly worlds which it had hidden all day long, he might be seen preparing his instruments with that solemn countenance with which it becometh one to look into the mysterious harmonies of nature. Now he learned what law and order and truth are, what consent and harmony mean, how the individual may find his own end in a higher end, where law and freedom mean the same thing, and the purest certainty exists without the slightest constraint. Thus he stood on the earth and looked to the heavens. Another, who had been much given to searching out the hollow places and recesses in the foundations of the castle, and who was often to be found with a compass and ruler working away at a chart of the same which he had been in process of constructing, now came to the conclusion that only by ascending the upper regions of his abode could he become capable of understanding what lay beneath, and that, in all probability, one clear prospect, from the top of the highest attainable turret, over the castle as it lay below, would reveal more of the idea of its internal construction than a year spent in wandering through its subterranean vaults. But the fact was that the desire to ascend, wakening within him, had made him forget what was beneath, and having laid aside his chart for the time at least, he was now to be met in every quarter of the upper parts, searching and striving upward, now in one direction, now in another, and seeking as he went the best outlooks into the clear air of outer realities. And they began to discover that they were all meditating different aspects of the same thing, and they brought together their various discoveries, and recognized the likeness between them, and the one thing often explained to the other, and combining it with help to a third. They grew in consequence more and more friendly and loving, so that every now and then one turned to the other and said, as in surprise, "Why, you are my brother! Why, you are my sister!" And yet they had always known it. The change reached to all. one who lived on the air of sweet sounds, and who was almost always to be found seated by her harp or some other instrument, had, till the late storm, been generally very merry and playful, though sometimes sad. But for a long time after that, she was often found weeping and playing simple little airs which she had heard in childhood, backward longings, followed by fresh tears. Before long, however, a new element manifested itself in her music. It became yet more wild, and sometimes retained all its sadness, but it was mingled with anticipation and hope. The past and the future merged in one, and while memory yet brought the rain cloud, expectation threw the rainbow across its bosom, and all was uttered in her music, which rose and swelled, now to defiance, now to victory, then died into a torrent of weeping. As to the eldest sister, it was many days before she recovered from the shock. I should have stopped and not read that sentence. Excuse me. Really pardon me. At length, start again. As to the eldest sister, it was many days before she recovered from the shock. At length, one day, her brother came to her, took her by the hand, led her to an open window, and told her to seat herself by it and look out. She did so, but at first saw nothing more than an unsympathizing blaze of sunlight. But as she looked, the horizon widened out, and the dome of the sky ascended, till the grandeur seized upon her soul, and she fell on her knees and wept. Now the heavens seemed to bend lovingly over her, and to stretch out wide cloud arms to embrace her. The earth lay like the bosom of an infinite love beneath her, and the wind kissed her cheek with an odor of roses. She sprang to her feet to behold the She sprang to her feet and turned in an agony of hope, expecting to behold the face of the Father, but there stood only her brother, looking calmly though lovingly on her emotion. She turned again to the window. On the hilltops rested the sky. Heaven and earth were one, and the prophecy awoke in her soul, that from betwixt them would the steps of the Father approach. Hitherto she had seen but beauty, now she beheld truth. Often she had looked on such clouds as these, and loved the strange ethereal curves into which the winds molded them, and had smiled as her little pet sister told her what curious animals she saw in them, and tried to point them out to her. Now they were as troops of angels, jubilant over her new birth, for they sang in her soul of beauty and truth and love. She looked down, and her little sister knelt beside her. She was a curious child, with black glittering eyes and dark hair, at the mercy of every wandering wind, a frolicsome, daring girl, who laughed more than she smiled. She was generally in attendance on her sister, and was always finding and bringing her strange things. She never pulled a primrose, but she knew the haunts of all the orchis tribe, and she brought from them bees and butterflies innumerable as offerings to her sister. Curious moths and glowworms were her greatest delight, and she loved the stars, because they were like her glowworms. But the change had affected her too, for her sister saw that her eyes had lost their glittering look, and had become more liquid and transparent, and from that time she often observed that her gaiety was more gentle, her smile more frequent, her laugh less bell-like, and although she was as wild as ever, there was more elegance in her motions and more music in her voice, and she clung to her sister with far greater fondness than before. The land reposed in the embrace of the warm summer days. The clouds of heaven nestled around the towers of the castle, and the hearts of its inmates became conscious of a warm atmosphere, of a presence of love. They began to feel like the children of a household when the mother is at home. Their faces and forms grew daily more and more beautiful, till they wondered as they gazed on each other. As they walked in the gardens of the castle, or in the country around, they were often visited, especially by the eldest sister, by sounds that no one heard by themselves, issuing from wood and waters, and by forms of love that lightened out of flowers and grass and great rocks. Now and then the young children would come in with a slow, stately step, and with great eyes that looked as if they would devour all the creation, say that they had met the Father amongst the trees, and that he had kissed them, and added one of them at once, "I grew so big." But when others went out to look, they could see no one, and some said it must have been the brother who grew more and more beautiful and loving and reverend, and who had lost all traces of hardship, so that they wondered they could ever have thought him stern and harsh. But the eldest sister held her peace, and looked up, and her eyes filled with tears. Who can tell, thought she, but the little children who know more about it than we? Often at sunrise might be heard their hymn of praise to the unseen Father, whom they felt to be nearer, though they saw him not. Some words thereof once reached my ear through the folds of the music in which they floated, as in an upward snowstorm of sweet sounds. And these are some of the words I heard, but there was much I seemed to hear which I could not understand, and some things which I understood, but cannot utter again. We thank thee that we have a Father, and not a Maker, that thou hast begotten us, and not molded us as images of clay, that we have come forth of thy heart, and have not been fashioned by thy hands. It must be so. Only the heart of a father is able to create. We rejoice in it, and bless thee that we know it. We thank thee for thyself. Be what thou art, our root and life, our beginning and end, our all in all. Come home to us. Thou livest, therefore we live. In thy light we see thee. Thou art. That is all our song. Thus they worship, and love, and wait. Their hope and expectation grow ever stronger and brighter, that one day, ere long, the Father will show himself amongst them, and thenceforth dwell in his own house for evermore. What was once but an old legend has become the one desire of their hearts, and the loftiest hope is the surest of being fulfilled. Well, I had not read that before tonight. I think I'll have to read it again. That's really special. That's really special. It is definitely a parable, and it is. I don't want to get into its philosophy or its theology now, but there's a lot in there pertaining to Christianity, not exclusively even to Christianity. I guess to Judeo-Christian thought. But even within Christian philosophy, different levels and layers. Kingdom philosophy, prophetic, Messiah, return. There's a lot of layers there. So we'll get on with that later. Okay, well, indeed, it's been 2 hours, and so I do feel a little zapped tonight. And so I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. I'm sorry I didn't get to the third story. I know the audiobooks on let me just click over here and see. I don't know how to switch my my screen over so you can see what I see yet, but we'll get there eventually. I think the audiobooks for are an hour and a half long. So yeah, that's just a little more than I want to do tonight. But I do want to do it. I think for next week, I'm thinking of if I do it next week. I'm not certain that I will, but if I do, I'm thinking of something a little more wonderful. Ooh, it's, I'm not sure. These readings are all over the place. I wonder how long it would be. Well, I'm not gonna surprise you with what it is, but it would be at least 2 hours, but it could be up to 3 hours. So, let me see. I'm just looking. Yeah, it could be up to 3 hours, maybe even 4. So I would say it'd be at least a 4-hour stream all told. I'm still open to it. I still want to do it, but it's, every time you do something, you learn from it, right? So now I know that, like, for example, I didn't get as much sleep as I should have last night, and then we had pizza and snacks at the party, and it was all salt, basically. And so I didn't drink, and I drank a lot of things today, but not enough water. And so, so I know, like, right now, I feel right now like I did 3 hours, even more than that, into with the Wizard of Oz. And so, I know if I tried to push 2 more hours to read Photogene and Nectaris, it might not be so pleasant for you to listen to, or for me to execute. So we're gonna stop for tonight. But hey, I'm really grateful for you all being here tonight once again. And just kind of as a last note, I'm doing this for fun. I've gotten some feedback about, your voice is great and you should read audiobooks. And so I'm sort of, kind of experimenting with that. And this is a good way to do that, I think, to get it out there and put the content out. As far as would I ever do this for real, for sure, I don't know. But I enjoy it. I like the reading. It's fun. And very grateful for any who come, but especially doing this to raise money for Children's Miracle Network hospitals as a part of Extra Life. And so if you have it in your heart to donate to support this amazing cause, the link is there on the screen. It's also down below in the About section, and you can click on the link and it'll take you to my Extra Life campaign page, where you can learn more about why I am supporting Children's Miracle Network hospitals and trying to raise money for the work they do. This such important work, and especially now in the midst of this international health crisis. And so thank you for being here, whoever was. If you popped in, thank you for coming by and enjoying. Not as long as last time. I know some people on the West Coast tuned in last week because it was later. I mean, I didn't finish until 1 o'clock in the morning this time last week. So I'm sorry to kind of cut off a little bit early, but I appreciate everyone who came to the stream. I wish you well, especially if you're listening back to this. It'll be on Twitch for a little bit in the archive. And so, so I appreciate you even going back and watching the recording and watching the archive version. I still speak to you as if you had been here tonight. I'm grateful for you for clicking over there and watching. I wish you all, a really delightful evening. And I do sincerely hope that you are all very well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.